week focusing on belonging, I can think of no one better to be sharing a conversation with than my good friend Rupal. And I know that it's something that you've thought a lot about and care a lot about, how to create environments where people feel a sense of belonging. And maybe just to start, why is it that you became so interested in this? Like even from an early age, probably you were thinking a lot about these issues. How did it get started?
Yeah, and so as I said earlier, I am by no means an expert in belonging, but it is something I care very deeply about.
I think she's an expert. Okay. I said that right to the camera.
But I think it started a lot for me early on. So, Mitch and others in this room know a little bit about my family story. And as we were talking earlier about times of not belonging, so a lot of my interest in belonging comes from experience of not belonging. So I grew up in an immigrant family. My parents immigrated from India in the 70s. My dad had been a lawyer in India, but then when they moved to the US, the law degree was not, had no reciprocity here. And so he was enrolled in school, but then he and my mom found out they were pregnant, and they were like, oh, we need some finances for this new baby that's coming. And so my dad started to try to find some jobs, and he did things like he cut cable in a factory, he babysat kids of friends and neighbors. And then he saw this ad for looking for support in a home that was supporting children with Down syndrome. And he ended up saying, okay, let me try it. It was at the night shift, which worked great because then he could do some of his other jobs during the day. So he tried it, and I was not yet in the scene, but what I've heard is that it was just kind of this light bulb moment for him, like, oh, this is really amazing. I want to do this. And so he decided to do this as his career. So he was a social worker for children with Down syndrome. And at the time, particularly, being immigrants into this country, into a place in the US where there weren't a lot of other immigrants, but then many of the immigrants coming from India at the time had very different kinds of jobs than being a social worker with children with Down syndrome. And so there was some stigma that my parents faced. They were told things like, well, we can get germs from you, or we don't want to be around you. And so my parents, for a long time, I do remember being very young and seeing them cry and hearing them talk about feeling like they were so far away from their country in this foreign place, and then also not feeling like people that looked like them were connecting with them. And so I think a lot of this curiosity around belonging comes from that, because also then, even though they experienced that, my parents, I think, are deeply people of belonging. So my dad passed away earlier, well, I guess it was last year. And I don't think I've told many people this story, so I will try it without crying. But a couple days after he passed, there was a knock on their door. And there's this man at the door I had never seen before, and he was like, oh, can I, see Mr. Jane? And I was like, I'm sorry I had to tell you that my dad, passed away a couple days ago. And he just fell to the floor. Mm-hmm. Like, he just fell to the floor, and he was crying. And I was like, okay, like, I don't know this person. Why is he crying so much, So I came out of the house, and I sat with him, and I was like, oh, can you, how did you know my dad? And he said that he met my dad like a year ago at a gas station, and somehow my dad had overheard him talking to someone about how he was having a hard time finding work. He had just immigrated from Jamaica. He couldn't find work. And my dad said, I think there's things at my house I could use some help with. And so this guy, P, he started to come over, help out around the house, but he said, my dad wouldn't just say like, hey, I need help with the windows, cleaning the windows. My dad would carry the ladder with him. My dad held the ladder, and he said the whole time my dad was asking him, hey, Pete, can you tell me a story about where you grew up? Can you tell me, what was it like for you growing up? What was your mom like? And my dad would share stories with him like, oh, it was really hard for me when I first got here, but you'll get there, and gave him a lot of comfort and encouragement. And the thing that like really sticks to me about what P said was, he said, your dad was the first person in this country who made me feel like a human being. and that really struck me because I think my dad was awesome. And but I also think for him to have experienced this not being seen and feel like belonging, and then not using that to be bitter, but then making that more empowered to feel like I want to create spaces of belonging.
Help other people to feel that.
Yeah.
Not go through that.
Yes. And of course, someone's calling me. That's not my kids.
Yeah, it's a powerful story.
Yeah.
And then, as you thought about those things, how did you then start applying it to your work? I mean, you've been through, different things you've done in your career.
Yeah.
How did these ideas about belonging and the importance of it, how did you bring that to the work that you were doing?
I think that for me, one of the first places I felt the sense of belonging outside my family was actually in school. I did feel like I was very lucky to have a lot of educators and teachers who did make me feel seen and encouraged me and gave me opportunities. And there was something about that I don't know, I was really drawn to. It was magnetic for me. I wanted to be more around those spaces. And so when I came to thinking of what I wanted to study in school, I knew in the back of my head, actually I'm an art history major, but I knew in the back of my head I wanted to explore teaching. And when I was...
And I'm just curious, when you were made to feel that way in school, do you think it's because it's a real credit to those teachers who made lots of people feel sense of belonging, or were they connected with you but not necessarily others? Or I asked that because probably for myself, I do think I had a sense of belonging in school, but I think a lot of the teachers didn't do it. I think I sort of fit in the category that they made feel belonging. They didn't, so I look back and have this not so good feeling, even though I was made to feel like I could belong.
I think it was a mix for me. I think there was definitely, I was good at school, and so it's probably easy to be liked and made feel like belonging. But I also know, like I've talked to you and others about my choir teacher, Miss Rowe. So I was in choir growing up, and we had like 350 people in this choir, and Miss Rowe knew everything about everyone without you saying it, you know. So I remember actually when I was in high school, my dad had a heart attack, and it was devastating, and I couldn't talk about it. Like I just shut down. I just didn't want to talk to anyone about it. I wanted school to be my safe space where I didn't have to think about the hospital and everything else going on. But she knew. She just like came up to me one day. She's like, "Can I chat with you? Is there something you want, like just, is there anything you want to check in with me about? Or can I help you in any way? Like something just seems like you're going through something." And I was like, I am. How did you know? But she was like that for everyone. But I do think I was also good at school and easier to be, you know, someone that.
Well, actually, that story reminds me, when I was in 4th grade, I was also good at school, and it's a different 4th grade story than I usually do. I think, yes, it's a different. She knows one of my 4th grade stories. I don't think you know this one. But same teacher who was, but again, since I was a good student, I was always, I think she wanted to support me in many ways. But I didn't have such a good voice, and we were going to put on some type of performance. She told me to lip sync because she didn't want my voice as part of the choir. And I do think, so that made me feel not so great. And I do think I started to at least get, looking back a little later, I certainly got the feeling, I can't quite know how strongly I felt it then, but I started to feel that I was made to feel that way about singing, and other kids were made to feel that way about many other things. That I think she made different kids feel that way for different things. And it happened that she didn't make me feel that way for most of the things at school, but she did make other people feel that way. So I think I got a glimpse of it through my voice.
Yes. Well, I think you have a beautiful voice. And you should sing loud all together. But, you know, I do think that...
The final session of the semester, we're going to have a group sing. And I'm not going to lip sync.
I do think, though, that I did notice that, you know, education teachers did have this ability to create that. And I also probably had that, you know, exposure to my parents at home, and then wanting to.
Then you wanted to do it for others.
I actually started off thinking I wanted to be a high school teacher, but then I realized actually you have more flexibility and ability to create these environments in elementary school, given the structures of school and schooling. And so I actually shifted and ended up doing a lot of work mostly with elementary school students, although I have actually worked in all of the grades, but most of my work there because I had the flexibility of time. Kids came in, I could do morning meeting, and we could talk about what's going on for us in our community. What's happening, like how are you feeling? And we had closing meeting where we talked about like things that were hard for us that day, and I like that. That to me was the real stuff.
Yeah, but it's not as focused on the specific discipline, which oftentimes happens later. That is interesting. That sort of led you to choose that because it had greater possibility. And as you took on other roles, I know that like as you started to help into starting with a new graduate school for future teachers, and I assume this is something you really brought to that role of trying to think about the role of belonging.
Yeah, those of you, if those of you who are in education might know that one thing that is talked a lot about in pre-service education, so preparation to be a teacher, is like classroom management. And so there's like, well, the best teachers have classroom management down, and like they have the routines down, and they know how to, get a class back and all this. And to me, that wasn't as interesting, nor did I think that was the root of the problem. And so when we had the ability to reimagine what teacher education could be, I was really inspired, had been in lifelong kindergarten, working on family creative learning. I got exposed to the computer clubhouse and the principles of the computer clubhouse. And I think Natalie was here a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and just to fill in the history, but for people, as I know, like probably a lot of the classes at Harvard Ed School, and you were at Harvard Ed School when you sort of met us, and so as a Harvard Ed School student, Rupal did work with us in lifelong kindergarten, and it was a great connection. But then after finishing Harvard Ed School, you then start with this new graduate school for pre-service education.
Yes, and so one of the things I remember being inspired by, I also worked in after-school programs, having been a classroom teacher, and in an after-school program setting, kids have like power, right? Because they don't have to show up. They can do, they vote with their feet, so they show up there, they don't, because of you and because of what you offer. So if you have a relationship with kids, if you're listening and creating spaces where they want to be in, they come. And so that to me was super powerful. I know with the Clubhouse too, it's about creating that environment of trust and respect that happens with the mentors and the members of the Clubhouse. And that to me is like what I wanted our teachers, what I hoped our teachers would be really good at reflecting on and thinking about is, instead of management, if you focus on the culture of trust and respect, that's really what we hope learning environments do for young people, right? Because it's not just about being a creative thinker because we have hard problems today. Yes, we have hard problems today, but those hard problems are rooted in historical, systemic issues. And we need people who are creative thinkers who also have compassion and who can value what we all have to contribute as a community, not just to solve the problem, right?
Yeah. Well, I do think that's one way. I think I've mentioned this directly in class, but I'm not sure. But a lot of times, until the last few years with our work in the lifelong kindergarten group, sort of the short phrase to describe it was, to sort of, just supporting creative learning experiences and helping young people grow up as creative thinkers. And of course, that is a core part of what we do. And it is partly over the last few years through a variety of influences, but partly with Rupal joining our team and sort of helping to elevate some of these thinking. I think some of it has always been there, as you mentioned, with the Clubhouse. When Natalie was here, she talked about the guiding principle of cultivating environment, respect, and trust. So it wasn't just about, designing things, but it was cultivating that type of environment. But now when we talk about, the quick description of what we're trying to do, we say cultivating caring communities to support creative learning. And I think highlighting that importance of the role that caring communities play in supporting creative learning and many other types of aspects of what we hope young people will develop. I think grows out of some of our continued thinking about issues related to belonging.
And I think it probably comes so naturally for like people in the group. But it was something that was a stark difference to me. We were talking over here that, when I was at the graduate school, I was at the ed school, there's definitely spaces where I didn't feel like I belonged. But then I would come to Lifelong Kindergarten, and Carmela was one of the first people who would meet me, and it'd be like, this warm energy. He'd always say hello. He'd always be so welcoming, and it was like, oh, okay, I want to be here. And that's not just it's just in the environment. Actually, years ago, you probably don't remember this, but I had asked you when I was at the graduate school to come and speak to some teachers, and you probably
actually, I don't remember. Actually, sorry.
So I'd asked Mitch to come, and it was our first thing we were doing with teachers. It was like 5 districts around the area, 5 superintendents, 30 teachers coming. It was a big event for us. It was our first thing. And I was like, Mitch, would you mind coming and speaking to them? And you kindly said yes. And I remember saying, like, I want to introduce Mitch differently than how he probably is introduced typically, which is like one of the co-creators of Scratch and, all these things. And so I had asked my friends, I think actually I asked you, Carmel, what is something about Mitch that other people might not, and Lifelong Kindergarten that other people might not kind of understand just by seeing the stats of what has been produced. And that came through in what you shared, Carmel, and what Rick Rose, who's another former Lifelong Kindergarten member, but Lifelong Kindergarten is a space where people feel cared for, like are seen as humans. And I know for me, like going through my dad's sickness last year, like I was just like, I felt so held by everyone here. Like I felt like I was not just this role, but I was really a part of a greater community that cared for me. And I think that then motivates people, and it helps even thinking about the kinds of projects we come up with and we work on, and the way we partner with people, right? It's that deep care. It's that the intention is the relationship. It's not transactional in terms of what we produce, but it's like I really am invested in who you are as a person. And I think that's something that probably, it is a part of all the design, but is not something people notice as much until,
right. But it's good to be explicit about it, because I do think it's important, so it's good to be explicit about it. Maybe there's a good segue, because you mentioned trying to then support that in the projects we're working on now. Maybe you can talk some about some of the projects you've been working on in the last couple of years, and in what ways you've tried to put this into practice.
Cool, yes. Actually, let's see. Well, one of the things I wanted to share was, so, we were talking about this earlier about the 4 Ps and how many people often do come to Lifelong Kindergarten interested in the framework and also the tools. And one of the things we talk about often is like, what is happening in these boxes in order for these little people things to be having these experiences, right? So if you were to imagine in your head, like, maybe there's a facilitator encouraging them. Maybe there's a music playing that speaks to their identity. Maybe there's a message on the wall. Maybe the way they're being invited in. Maybe they're being encouraged. Maybe it says, like, we want to hear your ideas on the wall, something. What are those things that are out there? And a few years ago, we heard from some colleagues at the University of Johannesburg who had heard about Scratch, who had also heard about the Lifelong Kindergarten book, and they initially came to us and said, we want to think about computational thinking in all of our pre-service education classes. So the University of Johannesburg is one of the largest pre-service teacher preparation organizations in South Africa, and they really want to think about this being infused in all of their different courses. And so they came here and they spent some time with us, and they learned about the Clubhouse principles. They learned about the Scratch online community, which I know Eric was here also talking about how this is a big part of the online community. They got to learn about learning creative learning. They also were invited into the learning creative learning facilitation community and saw how facilitators really thought about people feeling welcomed. Different languages that people might be speaking, how we also model not knowing and trying things out and asking questions and being curious. And so they started to then say, oh, actually, maybe it's not computational thinking we want to infuse into our programs, but it's this idea of creative learning around creating spaces where people feel welcome to express their ideas. Now, not that this group of people weren't already thinking like that. One of the organizers, Linford, actually his master's thesis was all about how you use WhatsApp for mentorship programs. But I think coming here and hearing some of the fact explicitly that we think about that gave that, I know Carmel, you said this, like legitimacy, right? Like gave these ideas legitimacy for him. And let's see, I did have a slide. If we put up, it's slide 13. The design principles from the University of Johannesburg. So they created, in the height of the pandemic, their school shut down, and they started to hear from their pre-service teachers, like, we need to do something. We need something. So Linford decided to start these creative coding clubs, and every Saturday morning, teachers voluntarily come into the space. They're greeted with this chorus of "Hello, buddies." Buddies is a purposeful word he has chose because he's actually a lecturer as well, so he's like a professor for many of them, and they call him sir outside of this space. But he wanted this space to be one where they were all seen as being on the same plane. So they're all buddies, so it's like, hello buddies, they tell jokes, they say, how was your week, what's going on? And then they work on projects together. And so the first principle of these coding clubs is this family-like space, and that he says to us, like, I always knew that was important, but then hearing it and seeing it in your projects, I felt legitimized, and saying that as my first principle, I wanted to make sure people felt that way.
I remember with the computer clubhouses, I remember visiting one computer clubhouse who was in, actually it was in Costa Rica, where I happened to be recently, but this many years ago, I was visiting a clubhouse there, and someone had been there the coordinator had been there for a year, and I asked him what was the most important thing he learned during the year. And he said it was different than he thought, because he thought what he was going to learn was he was going to learn all these technical skills, and he had to master the technology to be able to support people in different ways. He said the most important thing I learned is that it's really like a family here. If I just embrace that, then everything else follows. Mm-hmm. So the word family there sort of connected with it. And so in some ways I sort of saw that that idea of creating an environment of trust and respect really was that he was making it work if he really created a space that felt like a family. And he said everything else flows from that.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's interesting about that is that you can bring that to whatever space you're in.
Yeah.
So you can bring that idea of an environment where people feel seen and cared for, and you can bring it to computer science classes where you're teaching it, but you can also bring it to any kind of content area or after school program or birthday party or whatever.
Elementary school choir.
Or elementary school choir, right? It's something that transfers. And actually, I think I have here, if we wanted to show it, one of the reflection sessions that they had for the coding club, a participant was reflecting on this. Like, I was thinking, coding club? Why am I coming here? I don't know about this stuff. I don't feel like I belong here. And then she talks about how this, environment. So next slide. Yep, and then you have to scoot to 8 minutes and 8 minutes 5 seconds, I think.
Okay, guys. So my experience of the coding club, it wasn't what I expected, and that's a good thing. I thought that, even though I was going into this coding club, I didn't know whether I'd have enough of time to do or to participate in this. But I just want to say that the joy that this brought to me, the excitement that I felt on a Saturday to join the coding club, is what really motivated me to see everybody engaging, and the fact that we had the opportunity to actually engage with our facilitators, where they would help us and go through things with us. That actually helped a lot, because it didn't feel like they were instructing us and we were just doing. No, it was we were all working together, and that sort of gave you a warm feeling and a feeling of care, like you're part of a club where there's care, there's love and there's care. It's not just, oh, we're doing coding, this is what we do, this is how we do it. No, it was more like, let's learn together, let's do this together. And that is something that really motivated me, and it kept me going in this coding club, and it kept me wanting to participate just so that I could engage with the facilitators and the other buddies. So I really enjoyed that. And also, guys, it's the confidence for me. You guys are so confident. I love it. I wish I could have the confidence to be as open as everybody else. Like, I know Vui because of she was my tutor previously, and then now she's my the tutor coordinator. But like, I got to see her in a different light, and I love that. I love it. Even you, sir, like, I saw you as my lecturer, and you have that like feeling like, oh my God, he's my lecturer. How do I? But like, the relationship that this coding club has developed for me, I feel like it's so special. You see, look at you guys now. It's like, I really love that, and it's something that I would take into my teaching, because like, you guys made me feel like I was so welcome in this club. I would want my learners to feel that welcome in my classroom. So I really enjoy this experience, and I've learned a lot. Like, I keep thinking of how can I incorporate coding into a class.
Yeah, but that last part, you said, you've made me feel so welcome, and I want to make others feel welcome.
Right. And whether they're doing coding or not,
Yes.
if they're doing something else, the fact that she, as an educator now, is saying, I know what this feels like, I'm going to do this for my own people. Yeah.
Maybe before we open up to questions, I know that there was one of the readings about Octo Studio,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of thought that you and others have put into in the design of Octo Studio, how to take some of these ideas into account.
Actually, I'm also very excited that like 3 of our partners are in the room too. So, Octo Studio, I think for me, the beautiful aspect of it, one, I always say that it's like a model of the 4 Ps in action, right? It's a project that we're very passionate about, we've done with our peers in a very playful spirit, but the fact that it's not about, oh, let's come up with another tool. It was, okay, we've been in deep partnership now with these different organizations, and what they're saying to us is, hey, kids are home, they're away from school, they are needing something. We don't know if they have paper, or we don't know what the kind of access to a computer they might have, but we do know that all of our kids, or most of our kids, have access to a smartphone. Is there anything we can be doing? And so the fact that it came out of, again, this wanting to create spaces where kids can express ideas and share them. And so Octo Studio, as you read, has been developed in deep partnership with partners all around the world, including Mexico, Chile, and Brazil. And because of that, this dialogue, this back and forth interplay, this tinkering that we've done back and forth has been really, the app really reflects those aspects. So the fact that we heard from Kiara, who you just heard speaking, and Linford, that load shedding is a big thing in South Africa. They don't know when their electricity is going to get cut off, and it can cut off for 2 hours to 15 hours. They don't know, and but so we needed this to work without Wi-Fi and data, and so it does. Or thinking about the different identities of people who are going to be opening this app. A kid in Limpopo, a rural area in South Africa, to a kid here in Boston, or halfway around the world somewhere. We want them to feel seen in this app. Previously, you saw also like the emoji assets, right? Like we started to adjust. We've adjusted 90 of these emojis just to be more inclusive and more representative. Again, that feeling of, oh, this is for me. Actually, once you open the idea of the emoji library, you start to see all sorts of
things that you wish were different.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot. So we haven't adjusted everything, but we're trying to have this kind of like a North Star of pointing towards what we hope is the kind of library. And so you'll see like from the woman who has the hijab or the khimar, giving her a full body so that she can be actually animated and used. Having black hairstyles, thinking about non-binary hairstyles, thinking about figures. That was a big thing for me when I was doing this with my daughter. She kept including that dancer. Again, the standard ones are on your left side and the adjusted ones on your right side. But she started using this dancer in all of her projects, and I was like, oh man, that waist is really, I don't know about that, like how healthy that is. And so we started to look at them and go, wow, there's actually not a lot of different body types represented in this emoji library. And so just making those adjustments. Again, how do we make sure that someone who opens this feels like, oh, this is something
I'm part of this, yeah.
that is for me, that is making me feel, good about using, and doesn't further make me feel othered, right?
Yeah. Maybe now's the time that we should open up to, so it'll take a few minutes and people can write questions on that same, we can do it just right above where you wrote the belonging statements before. So at the top of that, So again, there are lots of good questions here. Maybe we'll start with it, which at least I would see as a very pragmatic one. Any advice for fostering a classroom culture of respect and trust in a resource-scarce environment, understaffed, large classroom students with varying needs? Who asked that? Do you want to say anything more?
Oh yeah, I've been substitute teaching in LAUSD classrooms recently.
Good for you. Thank you.
It's been fun, but I have been really surprised at how it would be me with 30 first graders. So I would love to hear about how you could implement this kind of in an environment like that.
Yeah, and I think that there are challenges, but I do think that it's, I think you probably also have answers to this, right? Like in terms of that space, when people come into that space, one of my people I admire in this work, Syra Pinto, she says, how you begin is what you build. And so I think about even in a space like that, as kids are coming into the door, are you saying hello, saying their name, asking them how they're doing, and then also what kinds of activities are you engaging with them? I know that it's challenging sometimes within the given structures of school. However, I think there's amazing examples, and I'd love to also share with you some examples of people who are making that happen. But I do think just also how you meet people, actually meet people, is a big part of that. And then, I also look for, one of the things I look for, instead of what I do, I also look for what happens. So I think of if kids are asking questions, if they feel lost in what they're doing, if they're laughing, if they're really excited to share with me something, okay, then this is the space that I want to create. Sometimes it's just carving out 5 minutes to say, hey, why don't you draw a picture, write a little bit, try and talk to someone about something that you care for, or something that happened recently, or a memory, a favorite memory. Let's make a list of our favorite things. There's all sorts of ways you can invite young kids, no matter what kind of resources, into little things, little tweaks to show that you care for who they are beyond we're in math class right now. It's math class right now, but it's how do you invite them into the day? And I'm also curious to learn from others as well. I've been in some situations like that, but maybe there's other ideas in the room, so I want to open it up if there's other ideas too for Hannah.
Just since you mentioned tweaks, I've sometimes heard you talk about sort of ways of bringing about change. They can start with small steps. And do you want to talk about that, the way you think about that? Yeah,
I know a lot of our work, we're thinking about how to shift spaces that are these big, historic, institutional spaces. And it can be really overwhelming. I know as a classroom teacher, there's a lot of pressure on me around time. There was a lot of things I was expected to accomplish with students in a short amount of time, or I was being evaluated, or they were being evaluated in certain ways. However, there's this idea of tweaks, jumps, and leaps. So maybe there's a small little thing I can do. So maybe instead of one way of demonstrating their learning, like a book report, we've seen teachers say, you can do a book report, maybe you could do a scratch project, just little ways of opening it up. And then thinking from there, what are larger leaps you can make, or jumps, or leaps you can make from there. So maybe you redesign a whole unit, or maybe you redesign a whole aspect. My last year teaching, I looped with my kids. So I had them for 3rd grade, and then I had them for 4th grade. And we decided for 4th grade we were going to revamp completely how we work together. And so we put up all the California state standards on a wall, and we took painter's tape and we connected ideas, and they generated all the projects for the year. They're like, why don't we do a travel agency project where we had this, like, we are in agencies and there's a, like, they came up with things I would never have thought of. And I then spent the summer, like, writing up their ideas, and then had the best, most wonderful year of teaching of my life, because the kids were like, yes, it's this project. And I still, I hang out with those kids, or I've been in touch with them. Still, it's what, 20, no, it's 15 years since I taught some of them, and they still remember things. Like, remember when I thought it was a good idea to put potato in the salad, with the watermelon salad for the kid, the cookbook project? Like, they still remember those little details because they were meaningful to them. But anyways, tweaks, jump, sleeps.
Maybe here are two questions that I think connect to each other in some ways. Any examples of good intentions leading to not belonging in the classroom that we can avoid? And then the one right after, what about when belonging of some defines the exclusion of others?
Yeah.
Is that also an unintended,
Yeah, and this stuff is really hard. Again, like, I'm still wrapping my head around it. So I hope that if you have ideas too, let's keep talking. But actually, do you want to put up that slide from Othering and Belonging Institute? I think a big part of this, and the hardest part about this stuff, and maybe Carmela, you'll talk about it too with facilitation, is kind of, yeah, what are you willing to give up? Like, what is your intention, right? So if it's belonging to fit this certain box, it's not actually belonging. It's still a set ideas that you have of what works or doesn't work. What are you willing to, what is your actual intention in supporting people and who they are? So this slide was really helpful to me. This comes from the Othering and Belonging Institute, John Powell at the University of California at Berkeley. So this is kind of, what is exclusion? So you think of this given structure with all these dots who are on the outside. Inclusion, the dots are now inside, but still within this given structure. But then belonging, you're maybe rethinking processes, organization, purpose, in order to make sure that people feel seen, valued, voiced, heard. And they have also this definition that I thought would also be helpful.
This one.
That one, yeah. This again comes from the Othering and Belonging Institute. So this idea that it's more than just being seen, having a meaningful voice and an opportunity to participate in the design of social and cultural structure. So it's not in a given structure, you are also being invited into the design of a social and cultural structure. One small vignette example of, I think, this in terms of how I'll connect to facilitation, one of our colleagues in our group, Cicely, has been doing some work at a local community-based organization called Black Yard, which really, it works very consciously on belonging for these Black youth who are participants there. And Cicely, brought some mini iPads, had put them out. Some kids were starting to explore Octo Studio. This was a couple weeks ago. And then at one point, because the kids have the agency, are empowered to do so, walked up, went somewhere else. They went to the foosball table, and Cicely went over and was like, "Oh, do you know that you could actually keep score for your foosball game?" And they're like, "What?" And she showed them how to do that, and they're like, "Whoa!" And they were so excited. They're like, "Oh, I want to do this!" And they started keeping score and keeping track. And it wasn't that Cicely said, "We're doing Octo Studio at this table, and this is the prompt, and this is where you have to be, and sit here." She followed their interests, their ideas. She invited them in. It was okay if they didn't want to use Octo Studio as well, if they wanted to use the counter. But she wanted to at least create that space where she'd follow their ideas and let them know this was possible, and then they were super excited by it. But again, it was rethinking what the structure was of the afternoon and the workshop. She went with them instead of thinking, oh, this is where this needs to happen.
Actually, I didn't ask who it is to put those questions up there.
Yeah.
Maybe we can ask that, see if there are ways that they want to sort of follow up on that. So again, there are a couple of questions there.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine was just the good intentions question.
Yeah.
I just find that there's so many moments where belonging happens so subtly, and we're not trying to exclude someone. it's like we're maybe more connected with some person in a classroom or in a work environment. We give a fist bump to them, and then we give a handshake to someone else, and they immediately feel like, oh, like I'm invited here, but I don't quite belong.
Yeah.
And it's not from a mal place. So I was just asking if there's more moments in a classroom, maybe we get to a facilitation where we make these small mistakes and we don't realize we're doing it.
I think that comes up too, and Carmel, maybe you'll talk about this more with facilitation, is when we say like, oh, good question, right? And we don't say good question somewhere else. Our colleague Zoe, who does some stuff with Scratch, Zoe is really intentional about how she responds to Scratchers in these like live YouTube scenarios that she has, where she doesn't, express good, bad, great. She says, oh, that's a really interesting idea, or thank you for sharing that, But it's hard because we're human.
Yeah, totally.
Right? It is really hard work. It's impossible to be perfect at this stuff. But I think the work is being aware and reflecting on it and wanting to grow on it. And also saying, like, if you notice that, like, can I get it? Would you want to give me a fist? Like, I just noticed I gave you a handshake, but a fist. Like, would you want to give me a fist? Like, you could just admit it and just. I mean, as a parent, like, you could ask my child, like, Mommy is so good at telling me all the things she did wrong today. I'm so sorry. I think I did that. But I think it is like being open to, hey, I am growing in this, and I want to do better, but I'm human.
Yeah.
I don't have the intention, but I can still have an impact that I want to be accountable to, and I want to have dialogue with you about it.
Thanks for that.
And in that, you're also modeling to people that they don't have to strive for perfection. Like, that's not the goal. Sometimes when we strive for perfection, we end up holding on to control so tightly that we end up having more adverse effects. And so, like, being a human and modeling being a human is probably the goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for saying that.
But we could pick others, but actually maybe we'll also just, okay, if there's somebody who just dying to ask their question. Sorry, didn't they? Okay.
This isn't my question, but I would love to know the answer to it. So the question is, who is someone that has inspired you lately? And I like that question and thinking about how you've thought about your work and belonging in the educational space. I'm curious if there's someone or something that has made you go, okay, I feel re-energized to continue to do this work.
Does the person who wrote that
sorry,
want to
I
say
don't know whose
No, that's
question
good,
that was.
yeah.
I just really liked it.
Does the person wrote? Go on.
Yeah, same.
Okay, great.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things. Mitch knows I'm like a podcast reading fiend, so I'm constantly like, I have multiple things happening at the same time. I have different like levels of that, answering that question. So I always think some of the most inspiring is like the day-to-day all of us, normal people who are trying and making it happen. So like my mom just was here, she left this morning. She's, grieving, going through a whole process, and I just like admire the ways that she's still putting herself out there, connecting, finding community, reflecting with me, like in this time of deep pain. And I think that's really, I wrote that quote too about belonging is aspirational. Like I hope that we are working towards a community, society that is more belonging centered, but it's also daily practice. There's definitely things we can do every day. Just like saying, I want to be more open to getting feedback or connecting with others. I also recently read Erica Chenoweth. She's a professor at Harvard. She has this book on civil resistance, which was super interesting about how nonviolent action has through history supported these revolutions. And it's also about being in these inclusive grassroots mobilizing movements from, like Myanmar to Iraq, Palestine, and others that she gives these beautiful case studies. But one of the facts I shared recently with folks is that it was so hopeful for me that she has found it takes 3.5% of the population participating in nonviolent action to result in dramatic shifts. 3.5%, which here in the US would be like 12 million people showing up for an action on a given day. but that something about that felt concrete and helpful to me. And so she has been inspiring me as well. And then I'm currently reading this book, When We Wonder, We Are Learning. It's from the folks at the Fred Rogers Institute. And Fred Rogers, what a guy. Just like the genuine thought he put into everything, and that idea too of creating spaces for kids to be curious, creative, and caring. Like those things, I think it has felt so synergistic to the kind of work we're trying to do. Those are a few. There's many of the people in this room, for example. I hope that you are getting as much as you can connecting with the amazing facilitators you have here, and then our partners in the back who I think you'll hear from. I know Anne, and hopefully you've heard from Rodrigo and Lula while she's here. The work they're doing on the ground is amazing.
I'll use this as an opportunity, actually, it came to mind as you were talking about the civil action.
Yeah.
A person who was celebrated yesterday, a lot of you probably don't know, but you might have read about it, the pair Mel King, who passed away a few weeks ago, who was an activist in Boston, and who was, his funeral service was yesterday. And there was something really special about Mel. So I'd encourage people to read the articles about him that have been published the last couple of days, or look at others. One thing that I found really special about him was, because actually I went on the night before, they had an open mic where people were talking about Mal, and to a lot of people who had inspired and influenced so many people throughout his life. And in one way, he was sort of this unapologetically focused on bringing about change to the system, but he also had this real gentleness and kindness in a way that don't always fit together. And people were telling stories about bringing their child over to some political rally, and then Mel would be off to the side just reading a book with the kid, and we were involved in various educational projects with him, and he had sort of such a way of sort of listening to everybody so carefully, but having his own strong voice. So it's this combination of someone who had this sort of powerful voice, but sort of a gentle heart that I thought made him just really special. Clearly touched lots of people and had a big impact in the communities in Boston and beyond. So he's someone who I encourage people to read about him.
Definitely.
But we are.
That was maybe the last question.
Okay. Oh yes, sorry.
Interesting encounters when I think of belonging. Have worked in completely no resource environment.
Yeah.
No, nada. Schools the schools don't even have a room. Okay,
Yeah.
Where do you think that how and where do you think there is a place for things like a smartphone and an Octa? Just for context, this phone is maybe more than the GDP of many the per capita income of many people in my country.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
phone.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I don't have anything,
Yeah.
no smartphone,
Yeah.
how do you think you can foster the spirit of tinkering in these students?
Oh, I think it's a great question. I think it's something we talk about a lot too, because I think one of the challenge is, and thank you for sharing that too. What was your name?
My name is Ronak. I used to
Ronak,
work with
okay.
the government of India. There's a program called the Adult Tinkering Labs. I used to lead that.
Oh, okay. Hi, nice to meet you, Ronak. So one of the things I think that is super important in our work, and I think is our responsibility of us in our work, is to make sure that people don't think it is Octo Studio or Scratch, like the tool, but it's really the ideas behind it. So how do you help kids have an idea, be open to imagining something, working on it, making something, even if it's telling the story, acting it out with their bodies, sharing it with others in a playful spirit. And so some of the things that we've done, particularly in the pandemic where we really didn't know what people had, right, was thinking about what are those generative invitations that no matter what you have in front of you, if it's just a stick in dirt or if it's a potato. We had someone carve a potato during a workshop in the pandemic, or paper, or if it's a phone, that you still feel invited in. So for example, something like we did something around making faces where we invited people to take things that they might have around them and try to construct a face. And maybe if they had a smartphone, they were exploring that also with stop motion animation or in Scratch. But they didn't need those tools. They could still tinker with it by making something, see if they liked it, see what happens when they change it a little bit. Similar things with bringing an object to life. We did a workshop where some people took paper and they folded the paper into many different folds, and they were exploring this idea with flipbook animation. The same thing as like sequencing, really,
Yes.
right? But it's flipbook, and then you can still do that also with a phone with stop motion animation, or with Octo Studio. You could do that in Scratch. But so I do think it is a great point that you're making, and it's really important for us to, and what we try to do in our work is to not say, oh, this is the solution, like if every kid had Octo Studio. It's really if every kid was invited into a space where it says, you say, hey, what are your ideas? Why don't we make that together? Creating together, creating a space where people feel invited to express themselves. That's the most important thing. And I do think we've seen it with our partners in many parts of the world, people in the same exact resource situations you're talking about, Ronak, who are making that happen. And I also think our responsibility is, as we've said, to share more of their stories so that others can learn about how this looks and what this looks like in different parts of the world.
Actually, in India, one person we found really inspiring was Arvind Gupta. Do you know Arvind Gupta's work?
Yes, Arvind ji, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Has been super duper supportive guy, and recently with the CCL, Center for Creative Learning at IIT Gandhinagar. He has been working to create these tinkering kits with no technology as such, using laser cutting and stuff like that.
Cool.
Also, this is a very interesting implementation gap which is right now happening with Scratch in India. Prasant is leading the Scratch initiative right in India right now with Python Foundation and a bunch of others. And he was also telling me the same thing, that two things which are a belonging issue right now is the students, when they see the English language, they feel out of place.
Yeah.
I have to learn English to do innovation.
Exactly, and that's
Okay.
a big part of, like Scratch is
That's
available in
a
many
larger
different
part.
Indian dialects, but also Octo Studio as well. But yes, I agree, language is a big part of it.
Yes, and second was, oh my god, I need to have a smartphone.
Yeah.
And this is something that I faced myself as a child.
Yeah.
At that time smartphones were not there, but I didn't have a computer, thus
Yeah.
I couldn't go.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is like super duper real, at least in the global south context. And
Sure.
that's where the demographic dividend is.
Yeah.
So these are some of the challenges which are coming on the ground, and I'm just speaking to my friends who are back in India and at
Yeah.
least the global south countries as well to realize what can happen and what cannot. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are sort of at the end of class. I would want to give a big thank you to Rupal for